Hello and welcome to this webinar. This is Shane McGlynn of IRM UK, and today I'm joined by Donald Farmer. Donald is an internationally respected speaker and writer with over 30 years of experience in data management and analytics. Donald will be presenting a full-day workshop on governance and compliance in the age of self-service with IRM UK on the 6th of July. And Donald will also be keynoting at our MDM and Data Governance Conference 2020, which takes place in London from the 2nd to the 5th of November. We welcome your questions via the questions pane. And now over to you, Donald.
Thank you very much, Shane. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here today, and welcome to this short webinar about governance and compliance in the age of self-service. This is a subject which is super interesting to me personally because I've been involved in the development of self-service business intelligence and analytic technologies for many years, really since this field started in the early 2000s. I worked at Microsoft and at Qlik developing these tools. And one of the challenges that we faced was we can create these great tools which give very powerful analytic capabilities to desktop and business users, but then people still have to govern and make sure that the data is managed correctly and that the decision-making process is managed correctly. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today. And there's a limit to what we can do within the scope of a 30-minute webinar, but I want to give you a framework for that discussion. So, as I said, I've worked at Microsoft, I worked at Qlik developing these technologies. This is what I've been doing for a long time. I live in the west coast of the US in Seattle. Fairly active on social media, so if you want to follow me, you can do that, Donald at Treehive. And very importantly, if you've got follow-up questions, we'll have some time at the end of this conversation for questions, but I'd also be very happy if you wanted to contact me at my email address that you can see on screen, donald.farmer@treehivestrategy.com. So what do we need to cover? Well, there's a whole lot of things that we would typically cover in a workshop on these topics, and the five sort of topics that I have here about defining governance, about the growth of legislation, about working with a data science team, how to work with data engineers in particular, what their role is, and governance strategy and ethics. That's the sort of thing that I would cover in the full day workshop. For now, we're going to give you a taster of that. It's just really, we can only just cover these topics with a light touch, but I hope to give you some sense of what the content is like. The first thing I want to do is to actually have some definitions of governance, compliance, security, and privacy, because I think it's very important to be able to have conversations where these subjects are clearly defined, and they're not always clear to people what these topics are. So I think of them, of course, as being very closely related. Governance, compliance, security, and privacy are all part of an area that sometimes we might just call governance as a whole, but I think it's important to say that there's distinctions between these things. Security and privacy, for example. I've chosen these icons very carefully. I like to say that if your house is locked and the door is strong lock on the door, then your house is secure. But if your drapes, if your blinds, if your curtains or screens are not closed, then your house may not be private. People can see in, even though the house is secure. On the other hand, you can draw all the curtains, draw all the blinds, but if you don't lock the house, you could be private, but not secure. And so you see that these things are related, but you can't have one without the other, if you like. Now, one of the important things about the difference between security and privacy is that even if you've closed all your blinds and no one can see in, if they can just walk in the door, they can still see you anyway. So you must have security. It's not enough just to have privacy. You must have security as well. And so there's a relationship between these terms. Security is not the same as privacy. Now, one of the reasons to have this distinction is that when you are having conversations with your team, you're having conversations with your IT department or your management, or if you're in the IT department and you're having conversations with business users, it's very useful to be able to make this distinction and say, oh, but is this a security issue or is this a privacy issue? Or, yes, I think that solves a privacy problem, but we still have to deal with security, or the other way around. Yes, that deals with the security problem, but it doesn't deal with the privacy of data. In the data world, security would mean protecting your networks, so that people can't get in from the outside. But privacy means, have you set the right permissions to the table? Is it true that the salespeople can actually see all the customers' data? Should they be able to do that? Is it true that the finance department can see all the HR data? Is that also something that should be possible? So in some cases, the network security side is a security issue. Who can see what data once they're in the system? That's a privacy issue. It's important to make that distinction. So security, protecting data from unauthorized access, privacy, the appropriate use of personal data. And when I say personal data, I really mean private data within the system. Governance and compliance have a similar relationship. One is necessary to the other, but just having one doesn't guarantee the other. Compliance is just that checklist of things. Have I actually done all these things? So for example, you may have compliance with GDPR, and the GDPR requires you to have certain sort of services, certain controls in place, and certain sort of agreements in place with your customers and your clients and your users. And so if you've done all that, then you are compliant. That doesn't mean your system is well governed. You could just happen to check all those boxes, but the governance is still pretty shaky at the back. On the other hand, you could be well governed, but because you've missed out one of the questions that you must be compliant with, you're not actually compliant. However, I would say it's very, very difficult to be compliant with regulations if you're not also well governed. So governance and compliance are related, but they're not identical. And again, it's useful to have those conversations with a team to be able to say, well, is that a governance issue or is that a compliance issue? Yes, we will be well governed, but will we be compliant? Or similarly, yes, we're compliant, but I still think we've got problems in governance. Those are really useful conversations to have. Frankly, if you can have those conversations with your team, then you'll be much more insightful and have much more effective discussions within your organization if you can do that. So there's this distinction between security and privacy, and a similar distinction between governance and compliance. But I have something interesting to say about governance, which sometimes takes people by surprise. Governance is not about making better decisions. Governance is about making your decisions the right way. Well, what on earth does that mean? I like to give the example of where I live. I live near Seattle in the USA. I live in a small town outside Seattle, and our local government, our local city council, it's a pretty good city council, they decided to build a new road around the warehouse district in order to provide access for large trucks and traffic, and to keep the large trucks away from the city center. And we had planning discussions. We had people turned up. We had public meetings about this road. Not everybody is happy about the road, but I think everybody could agree that we went through the right process. We went through the right conversation. In other words, we had good governance. Whether that was the right decision is a completely different matter. Did we come up with the right decision? Did the road go in the right direction? Does it, is it well built? That's a very, very different question. But the decision to build the road was well governed. So it might not be the right decision, but it was made in the right way. And that, for a matter of local government, is very important. In your organization, I want to emphasize that data governance, data management, decision governance, it's not about the quality of the decision you make. It's, did you make the decision in the right way? Can you justify the decision? Is there the right paper trail or document trail or analysis of that decision so that you know that the decision was made properly? Did people have the right access to data? Did people use the right data? Did people have the right permissions? Was the right security, compliance, privacy all attached to that? And if so, then we might be able to say that this was a well-governed decision. But it's very important that the quality of the decision itself is not what we're talking about when we talk about governance. We're talking about the process of decision making. One thing we have to watch in all of this is that legislation has grown like crazy all around the world. We have so many regulations now. I'd like to give this small selection of regulations that even a fairly typical international company might have to comply with in the world of regulation and governance and compliance. All sorts of legislation and new legislation being introduced all the time. every state in the US is currently sort of considering different types of data governance legislation for consumer data and for business data. So, there's a lot of regulation out there that you may need to be compliant with. How can we be compliant with all these sources is actually very difficult. And I have a suggestion, and I talk about this a lot in my workshops, and I think it's an interesting topic. I think one of the ways in which we can be governed is to change our mindset as IT users, as data management specialists, as data analysts, to change our mindset from being gatekeepers of information to being shopkeepers of information. And what I mean by that is that a gatekeeper is someone who keeps the wrong people out. We're going to protect our data. We're going to keep people outside the system who shouldn't be in. And that sounds like a very valuable, very, very kind of worthy role, if you like. But the problem is it gets in the way of people sometimes just doing their own work or just doing their analysis. In the world of self-service analytics, there's a truth that we sometimes don't want to face, which is that business users trying to solve problems will get their data one way or another. They can export it to Excel. We used to say at Qlik that every time somebody exports to Excel, an angel loses its wings. And what we mean by that is that when somebody's exported the data to Excel and can do anything with it, now you've lost all control of it. So it's very important that to understand that business users just trying to do their job, not bad people, not people who are trying to steal the data or leak it or anything, the people just trying to do their job will generally find ways of getting their data. So the idea that we can somehow keep people out of the system, that we can be the barrier to everything, we can be the gatekeeper, is actually not only impractical, it's not very helpful to people who want to do analysis either. On the other hand, if we become shopkeepers, then that's a different attitude. That is an attitude of we want you to use our data, but we will make the data available to you in the best possible way. We'll make sure it's fit for purpose. We'll make sure it's good data. We'll make sure it's clean data. We'll make sure it's secure. We'll make sure it's private. We'll make sure it's well governed. And then you're free to adopt the data if you like. Something that's very important about this is that this isn't a free-for-all. This doesn't just open it up to anything. The lovely lady in the picture, the shopkeeper in the picture, is selling cigarettes. She's selling cigarettes and tobacco. She's selling alcohol. She's selling lottery tickets. In other words, she's selling things which are actually highly governed. These are items around which there are lots of rules around who you can sell them to, who you can't. So being a shopkeeper isn't a question of having no regulations. It's a question of having regulations which are designed to help you serve other people. So it's a somewhat different idea. The gatekeeper is somebody who's focused on keeping people out. The shopkeeper is someone who is actually focused on inviting the right people in and making sure that they have the goods and services, or in our world, the data and services that are appropriate for them to use. And if we can make that mindset shift, it can be a very, very valuable way of approaching issues of governance and compliance in this new and rather complicated world. To do this, we need what I call a supply chain. Now, supply chain is, of course, something which a system, a process, which includes the raw sources right through to the final consumption of a product or service. And the one we're very familiar with is the way in which food gets from farm to table. It goes through different sort of processing and transportation. It goes through phases such as warehousing. The food will be in a warehouse, or will be in a storeroom before it actually gets consumed. We could consume the food through a restaurant where it's prepared for you, or you could prepare it yourself. You can buy the food, take it home, and prepare it yourself. In other words, there are different ways of self-service. There are different forms of preparing the food and different methods of management. Well, this gives you a clue as to what we might be thinking about when we look at governance and self-service of data, that it's possible to have, just as we can have a food supply chain, which goes from harvest through processing and storage, cooking and serving, we can have a data supply chain that moves through sources and integration and storage into different ways in which the data can be served. It can have self-service, where users on the desktop can customize and collaborate and export, just in the same way as a user can take food home and prepare it themselves. Or you can have food which is specially prepared for you in a restaurant. And in the same way, you can have data, which is specially prepared for you. You can have reports and visualizations, which are created for you. In both of these models, what you're really doing is not trying to manage the entire process at once. Nobody owns the entire supply chain from a farm all the way through to a restaurant. At least very few people do that. And not only that, but every item that appears on your plate actually has a separate supply chain. The potatoes probably come from a different location from the carrots, and the carrots come from a different farm from the meat, and the meat comes from a different farm from the fish, and so on. Some of your ingredients may be very exotic, and maybe spices from Asia, and it could be, avocados from South America, or whatever. There's separate supply chains for all these things. In the same way, if we try to manage the entire data supply chain, we can't, because it's complicated and involved with multiple different sources. What we can do is manage the supply chain of each ingredient, each data source, and the way in which those ingredients, if you like, these data sources, flow through the data pipelines and data processes into the different ways in which data can be managed and served. If we take this supply chain model, we have a process which is much more flexible than a traditional life cycle management process where we try to manage the entire cycle of data as a single unified system. We have to have a strategy to do this. And I'm going to suggest that there are different ways of building up this strategy. But I want to focus on these three layers, that you have a data and tools and techniques layer about, and the questions you should ask there are, what are the appropriate data, tools, and techniques, and what is approved as part of my governance process. We also have the processes and collaboration layer, which concerns questions like, why am I doing this? What's the purpose of doing this? And do I have a policy which can inform me and help me when I'm doing it? And then there's a layer of auditing and documentation, which includes questions like, can we answer these questions? What's appropriate? What's approved? What's purpose? What's policy? If we can answer those questions in advance, then we have a well-documented system, because there's somewhere I can go, there's some way in which I can find out what's appropriate, approved, and what's the purpose and policy. On the other hand, if we can only do those questions, or if we can answer those questions after the work has been done, then we have a system which can be audited. We can go back and see, well, was it appropriate to use that data? What was the policy that was involved? If you can complete this picture, if you like, with a full strategy that covers data, tools, techniques, processes, collaboration, and this questioning of audit and documentation, then I think you have a well-governed system. So your governance strategy should really kind of be aimed at addressing these questions in each of these areas. One of the other questions which comes up a lot, which we simply don't have time to cover in a lot of detail, is the idea of ethics. Ethics is kind of complicated, and I say it's complicated for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a very involved subject, it's a complex subject, but also we have different sort of ethical approaches, and these will be different in different cultures, different countries, different types of organization can have different ethical approaches. What's ethical for a business may not be ethical for a government, and vice versa. Never mind, it's a different kind of cultural approaches. But certain things that we need to be aware of. The question of bias comes up in ethics a lot, whether there's bias that comes from the computer technology itself, or whether it's bias which comes from the behavior of users and who are actually leveraging that system. But one thing I want to stress today, which is something we can dig into in a lot more detail in a workshop, is we have to understand that all algorithms, all data science to a certain extent is biased. It's actually the purpose of a system is to be biased. If you're building an algorithm to choose your best customers, then you're biased against your worst customers. If you're choosing an algorithm to give pricing on insurance, then you're biased against people who are difficult to insure, but you're biased in favor of people who are easy or cheap to insure. It's actually the purpose of the algorithm to a certain extent is to find the biases that we want. Of course, there's biases that we don't want. And so really that becomes the important question, not are we biased, but what are the biases we want and what are the biases that we don't want? And it's not enough to be able to go back and say, well, we audited this and we know looking backwards, if that was right, we're very tempted as engineers to build technical solutions. But actually, when it comes to data science and algorithms and artificial intelligence, we have to be more than engineers. We actually have to have a social understanding of how data is going to be used. And we need to think about the role of people in this. We need to develop our understanding about the people who will be affected by our decisions. In other words, we might be a little uncomfortable with this as engineers, but there's an element of kind of social study. There's an element of psychology, of anthropology, of caring about people as people. That is an important part of the use of artificial intelligence and data science in our processes. It's not enough to be technical about it. So if we were to build an ethical analytics system, again, something we can't go into a lot of detail today, but we can give you these building blocks to think about. We need to be centered around human beings and the use of information, both to help human beings, to serve them, but also to understand the impacts upon them, which means we have to be aware of bias. We have to think about bias in a formal way so that we can model it and structure it. We need to be able to explain what we're doing. And the system also needs to be trainable, adaptable. Having a system which has one algorithm and you put it into practice today and then 5 years' time that algorithm is still running, that's just not appropriate. One of the things we know right now is that the world changes dramatically from time to time and changes slowly all the time. And our systems have to be trainable. They have to change with the world as the world changes in order to still be appropriate. We have to have a level of transparency. In other words, we have to be able to see what the system is doing and interfere with that or control it or start it or stop it or correct the decisions if they're there. And I think to a certain extent, people who are being affected by these algorithms and these artificial intelligence systems should actually know that they're dealing with an artificial intelligence system. And systems have to be auditable. That is to say, we have to be able to go back and validate the decisions that were made using this system so that we can govern that process. So these are the basic building blocks. And as I say, we can go into a lot more detail in another context about how we deal with these particular questions. But I think any ethical analytic process has to deal with these six areas. That kind of is, I say, a very, very fast overview of what you can see as a very complex subject. But I wanted to at least cover those areas, that we can define governance and compliance and security and privacy in ways which help us manage it, that there is a process for managing governance and compliance in the age of self-service, which is to think about data as a supply chain rather than as a closed system. And as part of that supply chain, to think of ourselves as shopkeepers rather than as gatekeepers who are there to prevent things, shopkeepers who are there to enable things. Now, when it comes to governance, there's a strategy that we can build around the 6 building blocks of governance. And then when it comes to ethics, there's a set of building blocks we can use as well. And within these frameworks, I think it's possible to build systems which are flexible, flexible enough for the world of self-service, where business users can do their own analytics on the desktop, can ask their own questions, can select their own tools, and to some extent can bring their own data. And that flexibility is going to be as important as any of the more technical questions around how we specifically govern our systems. We need technical capabilities. We need organizational and personal flexibility as well in order to make that happen. So I hope that's been interesting. It'll be interesting to see if you've got any questions coming out of that. But do remember that you can follow up with me if you like, donald.farmer@treehivestrategy.com. And of course, the more detailed content is available as a workshop with IRM UK as well, which I'll be excited to take part in and hopefully maybe see some of you there. So with that, thank you very much, Shane. I wonder if there's any questions coming up.
Yes, thank you, Donald. A few questions here. First question, please. If governance is not about making better decisions, then how do we make better decisions?
Right, yeah. So governance, I say, is not about making a better decision. It's about making a decision in the right way. And we might think, well, that's okay. If we make decisions in the right way, perhaps better decisions will follow. And we'd like to think that is true. My suggestion being that it's a naive hope. Yes, we could still make bad decisions and have a well-governed process. And I think I've seen several companies who've done that. But if you want to make better decisions, in a sense, that's the role of analytics itself. So that's what you do with the analytic tools, the analysis that you do. And one of the ways in which you can do better decisions with analysis is make sure, first of all, that your analysis is accurate, so that you have an accurate view of your data. Make sure that your analysis is in detailed and insightful. In other words, that you can find within the data the information you need and the insights that you need. And then also that your analytics are collaborative. That is to say, that you can work with other people on it, because it's very difficult to make a good decision on our own. Typically, we need to have conversations with other people. We need to have insights from multiple people in order to come to the best decision. So you need accuracy, you need insight, and you need collaboration in order to make a better decision. In a sense, that's a different webinar, that's a different process, it's a different workshop, but it is important to understand that there is techniques that you can use to improve the quality of the decisions you make. Today, I'm particularly focused on the way in which you make those decisions to make sure they're well governed, but there is a practice around making better decisions as well.
Okay, thank you, Donald. One more question, please. How can I begin to have a conversation internally about ethics and governance when it is not viewed as important?
That's an interesting question. How can you have a conversation about ethics if it's not seen as important? I guess that the bad answer to that is one day it will be important. If you're not behaving ethically, if you don't think it's important, and one day I'm afraid that question will catch up with you, and that might be too late at that point to have the conversation. But I think there's actually two ways you can encourage the conversation. First of all, you can make sure that people are informed about what's going on with companies, or even in the news about ethical breaches. Sometimes we don't actually understand that there are issues that will affect it, and just being better informed about what's going on will remind us that there are data breaches far too often. There are breaches of ethics. There are plenty stories out there about what happens to companies and organizations who don't manage their ethics effectively. But I think the other thing that we can do is to make it clear that there are ethical guidelines even within an organization itself. It doesn't need to be outside the organization. It doesn't need to be about the ethics of using your customer data. We all have ethics and principles about how we use our own data, whether that's our own internal HR data, our own finance data. In other words, there's a set of ethical considerations that any company has around its own practices that we can then expand out to include the other practices of the organization. In other words, people say charity begins at home. I guess ethics begins at home as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Donald. Thanks to everyone who joined this webinar, and one more big thanks to you, Donald. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.